Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, I'll testify from down there.
Absolutely. The first member of that panel will be Mr. Polis from Colorado, Mr. Murphy from Pennsylvania. We'll have Mr. Blumenauer from Oregon, and Mr. Rohrabacher from California.
And Mr. Chair, if although I'm first, I've heard that my colleague, Mr. Rohrabacher, has a pressing event. If I don't mind yielding my first position and my prerogative as a committee member so he can testify briefly before me.
Happy to recognize the gentleman from California. Anything that you have in writing, we will make sure becomes a part of the record if you would like to submit it, and we welcome any comments that you may have. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Woodall. There we go. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to testify today. I'm here to make a case of why I believe my amendment, that's amendment number 9 to Division C of the underlining bill, ought to be made in order. The amendment is very simple. It prohibits the appropriated funds to the Department of Justice being used to prosecute individuals who are acting in compliance with their own state's medical marijuana laws. The provision would provide protection against federal action to the 46 states that allow some form of medical marijuana to be used within their jurisdiction. I don't intend to go into the arguments about whether medical marijuana is effective or not, but all we need to say is 46 states have already had that debate as to whether or not marijuana is effective or not, and have decided to allow marijuana to be used for medical purposes within their state borders. Today, the question is whether or not this body should permit the federal government to squash the prerogative of the states to set this policy, whether or not we believe that, that our founding fathers and others who gave us our Constitution really did mean for the states to have authority in criminal justice and other issues like this. The question is also whether individuals ought to be incarcerated now because in their states, even though they're in compliance with state law, that they could instead be incarcerated by the federal government. Polls show that nearly 90% of the American people believe that the federal government should not unleash its powers against those who are acting in compliance with their own state's medical marijuana laws. This shift is not only in public opinion, but it is in the fact that so many states now have moved and recognized that marijuana could possibly be beneficial to their people, and thus they have permitted marijuana to be, medical clinics to be set up, etc. After a string, and of course, this position of allowing the states to do this, and we have now permitted this to happen, this wasn't what it was, for the last 16 years. I know I presented this amendment to allow the states to determine what's going to happen time and time again, and it was defeated. We didn't even get a chance, well, we got a chance to bring it to the floor, but it was defeated over and over again. And then 3 years ago, the House voted in 2014, 219 to 189 to pass my amendment, which then was empowering the states to make these decisions. But when well, what's important right now is that when we were always granted the right to make the proposal, we were always granted the right to have the people vote on the issue. We were never told, oh no, we can't let the people vote on this. And I accepted the loss, and it got the bill down to the floor and the people had a chance to vote, our colleagues voted on it. Okay, you accept that. The word is out now that perhaps they aren't even, that my amendment will not be permitted, meaning that the people who have always had a chance to vote on it, down to the rest of our members, are not going to get that chance this year for some reason. I think that we have to understand that, in 2015, let's just note, not only did we lose in the beginning, but then we won in 2014, and in 2015, when it was permitted again, we won by even a bigger margin, which was 242 to 186. In other words, the public attitude is clearly shifted, and it's recognized by the members of this body. And I believe that we also have clearly a majority view of the members of the House of Representatives agree with this position. To deny them now the right to have a vote, I think is unconscionable. And it would not be right, and it would not be right for this committee to deny this House the opportunity to represent their constituents, because they now see the people of the states. If you've got, if you've got almost all of the states right now who have in some way legalized or liberalized medical marijuana, then if we have there's only 4 states that haven't done that. What we are doing is we are telling our people they are not even going to get a chance to vote the way their constituents would want them to vote. So I would plead with my colleagues, let us vote on this issue. Let us be, let our voters determine whether or not we are representing what their views are. Most importantly, I really believe in states' rights. I think the 10th Amendment is an important amendment to our Constitution. Our founding fathers never meant the criminal justice system, and you have police forces coming from the federal government down into our local communities. They always meant these things to be left up to the local communities. And so I am pleading with my colleagues to let's permit this to have a vote. Let us have a vote, that's all. And even if you do not believe that medical marijuana is something that could be beneficial for people, let us have a vote on this, because you believe that the people in this body who are elected here should have these kind of votes that would on the issue of states' rights. And one last thing, if my amendment is not permitted, and thus we do not, this is a change of law. The law for the last 3 years has been that the states, if the states legalize medical marijuana, the federal government will not interfere with that state and that position. We are changing that basic law, and we will be changing it without a vote of the people. We're changing the law that exists, and it will be noticed, number one, and there will be celebrations, all right. There'll be celebrations if we don't vote and we don't return this power back to the states, as we said, and we have federal employees, many of the people in the Department of Justice breaking into medical marijuana clinics and arresting people there. I can tell you who will be celebrating. Who will be celebrating are the drug lords down in Mexico, because a vote not to permit us to have this vote, not to let this bill amendment come up, and a vote against this amendment is a vote to shift billions of dollars that are now being used in medical clinics based on doctors' prescriptions, et cetera, for medical marijuana. That $3 billion will shift immediately to the drug cartels in Mexico. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And also, let's just note, if you don't have medical marijuana, and we haven't permitted the states the right to choose this, the prescription of opiates will continue, because we have eliminated the option for doctors to even consider offering medical marijuana for a number of ailments. And again, a lot of people in the profession, our physicians, have just too often just issued, hey, well, we're going to give these opiates. And now we have an addiction problem in this area. So I plead with my colleagues, let us be held accountable. Let this go to the floor, and let us reaffirm, if we do believe in states' rights, that that's what this is. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, let me just say, as a co-sponsor of this amendment, I don't need to testify further. I think Dana said it, and I agree.
My understanding from my committee colleague from Colorado is that Mr. Rohrabacher has other commitments. Out of deference to my friend from Colorado, I would like to ask if any of our panel has questions for Mr. Rohrabacher before he departs.
I actually do, as a panel member, if that's okay.
Let me go to the gentleman from Washington. No questions? Gentleman from Colorado.
Yeah, I'm glad you came here today. I mean, you made the case better than anybody. Can you tell us, has this amendment ever been blocked from the House floor before?
For 16 years. blocking the right of the members of Congress to vote on it. This is the first time that I have heard that it's possible that we will be blocked from even having to vote on the issue.
And I sure hope that doesn't happen. I mean, obviously the House needs to act on an appropriations bill. In the past, this amendment has been in appropriations bills. Has that ever been any kind of poison pill or caused trouble on the Republican side of the aisle for Republicans who've been here, who voted for those bills in the past?
We've had victory for the states' rights issue of medical marijuana for several times, and it's been included, by the way, not only in this, but in continuing resolutions, et cetera. So we've had this in place. This law is in place for the last 4 or 5 years, and nobody has seen that as a poison pill to vote against needed legislation.
And just lastly, it's my understanding this came up last in 2015 when it was included in the bill. 230 Republicans voted for that final bill that included that language. So I mean, wouldn't you say that's hardly a poison pill?
That's correct. And I could make one last point, and that is for those Republicans that, okay, there's an honest disagreement whether you think marijuana is something that should be used as treatment for people with arthritis or whatever treatment is used. Well, to those folks, let's say, at least let all of us vote on this and give people the freedom in the states to make those decisions. And I respect these people who are, I understand the prejudice that exists against medical marijuana. People can't get it. I know there's a lot of people can't get over the fact that the Cold War is over. Well, they can't even get over the fact that the 60s are over as well. And medical marijuana now can be used, and that decision should be made at the state.
And if I could ask just one more question, don't you think that with so many Republicans and Democrats who care about this bill, don't you think this could be a poison pill if this protection language is actually stripped out of this bill in terms of potentially losing Republican votes?
I would hope people take into consideration of whether they're going to vote for the bill or not. And one last note, and that is the President of the United States, Donald Trump, during the campaign made it very clear that he was for leaving this issue of medical marijuana up to the states. He said he's been recorded on this, the video, et cetera. So the president himself, during the campaign, took this position. So
thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I thank the gentleman from California. If I could ask the gentleman from Oregon to remain with us if any other questions arise, I'd be grateful. You have the same arrangements?
I just want to say I strongly concur. We had no problem getting it into the continuing resolution. The points that our friend from Colorado just made with Dana, I think it actually weakens the bill if it's not there. This is supported by over 70% of the American public. And in Florida, for instance, there was a 70% yes vote. It would be a tragic mistake to lose this progress that we've made.
I thank the gentleman.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania. I thank the gentlelady for her testimony. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you. I have a number of things to talk about here today. First, I want to talk about the amendment that Mr. Rohrabacher talked so eloquently about. And of great concern, in a September 6th article from The Hill, it stated House GOP blocks vote protecting medical marijuana states. And I want to be clear, Mr. Chairman, isn't it prerogative of this committee as opposed to the Republican conference with regard to what amendments went forward? In fact, there's a quote from Duncan Hunter, the neighbor of Dana Rohrabacher, who said that in the conference, it was discussed that this amendment splits the conference so much, so we're not going to have a vote on it. And I just want to ask the chair if Duncan Hunter is on this committee.
The gentleman's testimony is being accepted at this time.
I don't see him. I see Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins is gone. I see two Democrats and a Republican. Perhaps I should call the question. No, the answer is that the Republican conference and Mr. Duncan are not, or Mr. Hunter are not on this committee. The issue is this has been passed by Republican majorities for years. 230 Republicans voted for a spending bill that had this identical language as part of it. Not only that, the public mood has gone further that way. I mean, there's no I don't think there's any Republicans that favored the Rohrabacher, Blumenauer, Polis, and language several years ago that have changed their mind and are now against it. If anything, more Republicans are supporting it. So I hope that this was simply an incorrect fake news article from September 6th. There's been a lot of that going around. Obviously, it is this committee, the Rules Committee, that makes those decisions, not the Republican conference, but the special chosen few who've been placed here with a serious institutional responsibility to decide what amendments go forward. Again, prior Republican majorities have voted for the Rohrabacher language in spending bills. And if there is any poison pill here, as Mr. Rohrabacher indicated, it would be removing that language from that bill, because those of us who come from states that might be targeted by the Attorney General, absent this language, would be hesitant to vote for a bill that could be used as a double-edged sword against our own states, Democrats and Republicans from the many states that have medicinal marijuana. In fact, a majority of the country lives in areas that have legal access to medicinal marijuana. So I hope that this was just a fake news article. I truly hope that the Rohrabacher, Blumenauer, Polis language is moving forward. I also want to talk about several other amendments that we have that I sponsor with regards to marijuana. Along with Mr. McClintock of California, I have an amendment that would prohibit the federal government from spending taxpayer money to interfere with state marijuana laws. Now, this would apply not just to the medicinal side, but also to the increasing number of states that have a regulated system for selling marijuana. And at this point, by the way, 95% of the country in 46 states have some form of legalized cannabis. As you know, Colorado was one of the first test cases for creating a regulatory system around recreational sale of marijuana. So far, indications are positive. It's decreased teen usage. It's helped bankrupt drug cartels, reduce violent crime, increase taxes. But regardless of the personal opinions of members of Congress about this issue, isn't it the business of the states to decide? And wouldn't, in fact, the McClintock-Polis amendment simply reassert that it's none of the Attorney General, Department of Justice's business with regards to the state regulatory system for marijuana? It's not a partisan issue. 18 members of Congress, 9 of each party, sponsor the McClintock-Polis amendment. I feel confident it would pass if we get a vote on the floor. You don't even have to support marijuana legalization to support the McClintock-Polis amendment. You certainly don't have to support legalization to allow us simply having an up or down vote on the floor. This is an important issue, and according to a recent poll, 71% of Americans agree the government should not enforce federal marijuana laws in states that allow its use. Majorities of Republicans, of Democrats, of independents all support that common sense position, and all we're asking is for the Rules Committee to simply advance the McClintock-Polis amendment to the floor. This amendment is a very simple one, and I think it's an important next step. Now, I encourage the support of the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer amendment, formerly known as the Rohrabacher-Farr amendment, which I also co-sponsor, which is essentially in form identical to the McClintock-Polis amendment, but focused on medical marijuana only. So at least let's keep those current protections in, but let's give the House a chance to vote on extending those protections to states like mine that regulate the sale of marijuana. I also have an amendment 104 to CJS that would along with Ms. Bonamici, that would prevent the DOJ and DEA from spending any funds to interfere with state legal industrial hemp programs. We have a bipartisan Industrial Hemp Farming Act. This would put an important prohibition to make sure that many states have moved forward with growing industrial hemp, which is regulated through our State Department of Agriculture. And this would simply remove that federal axe that's hanging over the head of hemp farmers in our states. I also asked the committee to make an order the marijuana research applications amendment number 72. One of the reasons that we need protections, frankly, from DEA and DOJ is because of the aggressive stance of the Attorney General and towards cannabis. I would point out that, again, this is contrary to the positions of the President as he dictated on the campaign trail and once in office. The Attorney General has been attacked by the President, his boss, on many matters, And I think that this is another matter where President Trump simply disagrees with the direction of his rogue Attorney General, and we have the opportunity as Congress to support the position of Republicans, Democrats, and the President in reining in Jeff Sessions' out-of-control authority. In a report of August 15th in the Washington Post entitled Justice Department at Odds with DEA on Marijuana Research, which, without objection, I'd like to submit to the record.
Without objection.
It indicates that, quote, the Justice Department under Attorney General Jeff Sessions has effectively blocked the Drug Enforcement Administration from taking action on more than 24 requests to grow marijuana to use in research, end quote. So this is kind of that chicken and the egg thing. The opponents of medical marijuana, like the Attorney General, will say there's no evidence it works, and then they're actually the ones that are putting the impediments in place to prevent any evidence of whether it works or not. These scientific studies could show it doesn't work. But they shouldn't be blocked. They should be allowed to move forward. Again, I personally believe, as Mr. Rohrabacher also indicated, that for the subset of people for whom medical marijuana can work for pain management, it is a much less dangerous and less addictive treatment than the prescription opioids, which have led directly to so many deaths that have devastated our communities. There's only one reason to deny the approval of research on marijuana, perhaps because the Attorney General fears that science will show that it could actually work to address particular health issues, including pain management. That's why I've introduced this amendment number 72 that would prohibit taxpayer dollars from being used to pay the salary of personnel who fail to act on an application for marijuana research. We've got to get that, end that bottleneck and allow the research to occur. Finally, with regard to cannabis, my amendment number 97 that I've co-sponsored with Representative Liu of California, this amendment would prevent the DEA from spending funds on the domestic cannabis eradication or marijuana suppression program. The program has been a costly failure. In October of 2016, we learned that many states received suppression funds but failed to eradicate a single marijuana plant. The state of Utah received $73,000 of taxpayer funding and didn't eradicate a single marijuana plant. It makes no sense. It's a waste of taxpayer money. 46 states have legalized cannabis in some form or other. Our state routinely finds illegal marijuana and destroys it. It's ridiculous that federal money is going to states that don't even destroy marijuana. It's obvious that spending money on this program does not make sense. Those are very important for my state, and I hope that we can move forward with regard to those amendments. I also have amendments in other areas. In education, one of my top priorities in Congress, I'm honored to serve as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education on the Education and Workforce Committee. And I want to highlight a few programs that are priorities for me and our district. I have an amendment to talk about the importance of Title II, which is training around educators and support. Title II is the most valuable program we have in K-12 to ensure that students are being taught by the very best teachers. The teachers can develop and improve their teaching methods. In this budget request, President Trump suggested cutting $2 billion in funding for professional development in Title II-A. In Colorado alone, this would mean a loss of $22 million in funding to help train our teachers. My amendment, Polis 102, would reinstate that funding. I also want to say that I support Representative Price's amendment number 53, which would restore cuts across the board in Title II. I would ask that both be made in order. Next, I want to speak about Title IV, Part A of ESEA. When we wrote the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, we made a decision to support state flexibility and local control. And one of the ways we do that is through block grants in Title IV, Part A. These funds go to supporting STEM programs, arts and civic education, or important programs like dual and concurrent enrollment, which help students afford college. Unfortunately, the appropriations bill before us severely underfunds Title IV Part A, and I'm co-sponsoring several amendments, including Bonamici 135, Bonamici 136, and Bonamici 137, that would increase funding for this important program. I ask that those be made in order. Finally, with regard to education, I want to speak about the EIR, Education, Innovation, and Research Program. EIR was introduced during the Senate markup of the Every Student Succeeds Act as a bipartisan amendment by Senators Hatch and Bennett. It was adopted by voice. Early research shows that I3 programs, the successor to EIR, is working. It's helped support programs in Colorado, like in St. Vrain School District, where it supported a school that allows students to get college credit while they're in high school in a PTEC model. My amendment, Polis 103, would help continue this success by funding EIR at $100 million, simply at the same level as the 2017 funding. With regard to the Interior Appropriations Bill, I have an important bill for volunteer fire assistance I've offered along with Jim Renacci of Ohio. It's a bipartisan amendment. It's small but important because little money goes a long way with regard to our volunteer firefighters. This would simply increase funding for volunteer firefighters by $1.3 million, increase state fire assistance funding to $11 million. These funds are awarded to volunteer fire departments protecting small communities of fewer than 10,000 people, including a number of small mountain communities in my district. With fires and natural disasters getting worse due to climate change, we need to work on the front end to prevent these fires from ever happening, and that's what these funds do. We've seen in my district in Colorado so much ash and smoke in the air that's caused visibility and health problems from dozens of wildfires raging across hundreds of thousands of acres. Just one example is the Deep Creek fire raging in northwest Colorado that was on top of a fire earlier this summer called the Peak 2 fire in my district near Breckenridge, which forced the evacuations of hundreds of community members. Our fire agencies are underfunded. This simple amendment, number 75, does not fully address that, but it helps provide some more funding for our volunteer fire departments that are our front lines of defense in many of our rural areas. I also have an amendment, number 77, to increase offshore drilling fees to 5% to fund wildlife management. I personally disagree we should be destroying our oceans with massive drilling operations, but if we're going to continue that route, I think it's important to make sure that taxpayers are made whole. My amendment would simply do that and ensure that there is a reasonable royalty paid to taxpayers. A small 5% increase in their fees would go from $10,500 to $11,025 in one case, or $17,000 to $17,850 in another. It's a drop in the bucket considering the value that corporations get from the drilling in our ocean areas. ExxonMobil had a profit of $4 billion. Chevron's was $2.7 billion. We've talked about how underfunded our firefighting is, and this year in the West, the damage will be billions. So a small fee for offshore drilling to pay for wildfire suppression, I would hope is common sense. I've also offered Amendment 76 to the Interior Bill. It's simple. It would offer members a clear choice to tell your constituents whether you want to keep our public lands in the hands of those who rightfully own them, the public, or privatize those lands. We've had a vote on this in prior sessions. I think it's important with the new Congress to do so again. My amendment ensures that none of the funds made available through this bill can be used in violation of the law that exists that prevents the privatization of our public lands. My amendment would prohibit the use of funds to pursue any extralegal ways to turn our federal land over to private owners through a commission or any other means. The district I'm honored to represent, Mr. Chair, is 60% public land. Our public lands are beautiful, they're majestic, and they're important not only for the good of our soul, but they're also one of the largest economic drivers in my district of jobs and throughout the Rocky Mountain region and across the country. Over $646 billion is generated through outdoor recreation on our public lands. Visiting our public lands supports over 6 million jobs, including 3 million visitors a year to Rocky Mountain National Park in my district. From small businesses to ski resorts that are leaseholders on public land, from gas stations to diners, our economy thrives in districts like mine and across the country because of our public lands. A recent poll across 6 western states shows that 96% of Americans support protecting public lands. It's clearly a top priority for those who live in the Rocky Mountain West and for those who want public lands to stay public. So I would hope that Amendment 76 is made in order to accomplish that. I also offered Amendment number 88 to the Interior Bill to address the ridiculous plan by the EPA to close regional field offices. We know the EPA leadership has its priorities backward, focusing on how they can help coal companies as opposed to keeping our air and water clean. But when they're talking about closing 2 of the 10 regional offices, including one in our area, I was very disappointed. And the EPA's regional offices and their thousands of hardworking public servants are in the field. They're critical when it comes to improving public health and safeguarding the environment. Shuttering them and slashing EPA resources would jeopardize the safety of communities in Colorado and across the country. Mr. Chair, I asked that my amendment number 54 be made in order. I introduced it along with Ms. Titus and Mr. King. It would restore language to protect wild horses from senseless and inhumane slaughter. We would simply put language back in the bill that's appeared in over 20 years of appropriations bills that would prohibit the Bureau of Land Management from killing healthy, unadopted wild horses in burros. This is a top priority for so many of us who value wild horses as part of our Western heritage and our American heritage. 80% of Americans favor continuing congressional protections for wild horses. Allowing BLM to wipe away years of mismanagement by shooting our wild horses and burros is something Americans are unlikely to forget or ever forgive. And we can stop them right here, Mr. Chairman. Yes, there's challenges to be faced in the management of our wild horses, but the BLM has failed in actually doing constructive planning. We can save taxpayer money and engage in a more humane policy by including this amendment. This role was recognized of the BLM when wild horses and burros received protection with the unanimous passage of the 1971 Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. Taxpayer funds should not be used to shoot our beautiful wild horses. The BLM has no management plan. If they kill thousands of wild horses and burros, we would face the same situation again in a few years. Instead of killing our icons of the West, the BLM should work with stakeholders and people on the ground in our communities to produce sustainable long-term plans for wild horse and burro management on the range. We can have a less costly and more humane way to address sustainable population levels for wild horses and burros and make sure that they are still a part of our Western heritage for ourselves and for our children. These are the amendments that I asked to be made in order, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to take any questions from the committee.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony. Does the gentleman from Georgia have any questions for this panel?
No question, but I would like to thank everyone for coming and offering them, especially Mr. Murphy. We've talked about the microphone. By this point, we lose all track of what we're doing up here. There's the microphone. Mr. Murphy, Congressman Murphy, we've talked about mental health, and I appreciate your highlighting that, especially with the my legislation that for the Mentally Ill Offender Treatment Program Crime Reduction Act, which I think is legislation to reauthorize these programs, putting more funding there is essential to making sure that we're actually focused on the issues of law enforcement, also on the focus of the dealing with those with mental illness, and especially in our offender program. There's some things that we've been working on, especially in dealing with criminal justice reform and recidivism issues, things like that we're working on, that all play into this and making sure that we have the treatments there. So I appreciate you bringing the attention to this issue that I care deeply about, and mental health issues surrounding not only outside but also in our military as well, from my perspective in the Air Force and yours in the Navy as well. So these are things that I just wanted to highlight, and I thank the rest of them for coming and having this process, and look forward to supporting that as we go forward on the floor. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I support making all of our colleagues' amendments in order. All of them are very thoughtful measures that we should consider. I mentioned your name, Mr. Murphy, when I was questioning Chairman Cole, who is also a member of this committee and a good friend of mine. I put the question to him about cutting access to mental health prevention services, and I only mention it to you because I know the extraordinary work that you've put forward, and it's your profession. You understand that very well. I also think you know that I've worked very actively with you and others, Eddie Bernice Johnson, for example, in this area. His statement to me, and it's something we ought to be mindful of, was to the effect that all of this is an opening negotiation, the first line of an opening negotiation, meaning that there are going to be other opportunities to correct some of these measures. So we want to keep that in mind as matters travel and try to hold he and others to their promises that we may be able to restore some of these funds, particularly in mental health. Ms. Lee, you have been a champion on all of the issues that you've just raised, including other measures that I won't go into now, but I do want to highlight just one that I think is about the most crass thing that I've seen here. Your amendment trying to restore funds, I forget whether it was $54 or $59 million that was cut from the minority AIDS program, zeroing it out, I might add. I can't even fathom how they came to that decision. And I hate to see things through a racial prism, but my goodness gracious, I know you had a measure some years ago when this issue was that first arose. We had to pull and beg and plead to get funding for the Minority AIDS program. And I think you remember that I offered a measure that plussed up that program. And now we are in the position where it's going to be zeroed out. I would just remind my friends, although maybe many of them do not find themselves in the throes of communities that hurt like this, a lot of people who are not minorities participate in sexual conduct with minorities. And so if we want to make sure we cure this problem, then we need to be sure that it's not just all in the minority community where AIDS is. It's spread according to those who participate in conduct that may allow for its spread. And that ranges from just sexual conduct to needle exchanges, the whole 9 yards, that gives rise to the cause of AIDS. I consider it crass, mean, unnecessary, and irresponsible, and in the final analysis, tell all our colleagues that I said it was racist for them to do that. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Colorado have any questions for the other two?
I think my own amendments are particularly inspired, but I also agree that the amendments of my colleagues should be made in order.
I thank the gentleman. Thank you all for your testimony. I know the gentleman from Colorado had some materials to submit for the record.
Yes.
If anyone else has any written materials, if you will leave those with our stenographer, we will make sure those are included. This concludes this panel. We will welcome to our next panel, assuming no one's been removed. They have not. Mr. Lewis,